in this section of the broadcast Abhijit Roy. He's the managing director of Berger Paints. And as we get those pictures also of a finance minister perhaps reaching Rashtrapati Bhavan, if I could ask you, Mr. Roy, what are your expectations from the finance minister as she takes to the podium in about an hour's time?
I think the first expectation is that there will be a boost to demand, and the consumer demand has been a bit stagnant for the last 5-6 months, and we expect that there should be some sort of a tax break given to the consumers, which will push up demand to some extent. That's the first thing that is expected. Of course, infrastructure push along with the Prime Minister Awas Yojana, I think that will get an increased allocation and probably will continue as has been happening in the past few budgets. So those two things are expected. The rest, of course, in the rural areas, again, I think the government will continue to look at, how to increase the farmers' income. There's another, consumption driver as well. With the increase in consumption, there will be probably increase in capex of private companies as well, and then that is beneficial, and it sets off a virtuous cycle in terms of increased demand, increased investment, and therefore increased employment as well.
Right. Markets are in fact egging on the finance minister to make some big ticket announcements so far as the consumption story is concerned. But if I could do a follow-up question with you, Mr. Roy, before I go back to Ajay and Sushil Kedia. You say that consumption has not been in the best of territory over the last 6-7 months. And of course, that's the picture everyone else is also talking about. But why, from your industry perspective, given that it's a contributing segment insofar as the larger construction industry is concerned, how you explain this dichotomy that the RBI says there is too much happening in the housing space? Even the markets are reflecting that, the real estate sector, and yet is it not percolating down to your segment of the industry, the paints, given the fact that the housing market is actually doing well?
No, it's right, because in our case, in the paint, especially the household painting sector, 80% of the demand is from the repainting side, and 20% comes out of, 15 to 20% comes from the real estate new buildings. So new buildings are doing fine, and that is growing reasonably well. But the 80%, which is the repainting cycle, which is there, the repainting consumption has gone down a bit, largely because of, the income being restricted in the hands of consumers, and that's something which needs to be boosted a little bit, I think, in this budget.
Okay, what's that silver bullet, Ajay Garg, then, which can bring out the consumption story back on track, according to you?
I think it may not necessarily be addressed.
Or is there a silver bullet? Perhaps there is no silver bullet. There could be some measures.
It's very hard to, for a large country like India, to only find one bullet. That's a difficulty part of the complexities of this country. But if you were to look at it, one of the things which did impact, and it may not necessarily be covered in the budget, is that the interest rate scenario, which also was talked in the last economic report, that we do want to look at some relaxation there, which may obviously give a much more fillip in terms of, because I think one of the big factor which has impacted consumption is that a lot of in the housing sector, the mortgages costs have gone up. So people who did doing post-COVID also look for a little bit of a better situation, suddenly realize that from loans they had contracted had gone up. So I think that has an impact on consumption. So I think that could be one way to help the segment where Mr. Roy works out of, that if a consumption can be improved by looking at the interest rate scenario. And this is not something which comes in the budget, but it's more of an RBI outlook, and hopefully that will happen subsequently.
Abhijit, I'll just bring back the focus in your sector, because for the government too, the clarion call has been housing for all. So that in itself would ensure some sort of a boost in the consumption, which would effectively have that the allied sectors would also benefit from it. So where is this entire narrative really emerging from, that, at the end of the day, it appears to be some sort of a, doomsday kind of a narrative that we've been peddling for some time now, that, there hasn't been any growth, and perhaps that there isn't enough push?
No, so it's not a doomsday narrative as such. As I said, in our case, 80% is basically repainting demand, which is basically existing houses who paint every 5 to 6 years. the new house, consumption is about 15 to 20%. So this boost that is given by the government as far as projects are concerned, like the Prime Minister Awas Yojana, it does help. But 80 to 85% has also to kick in. Now if you look at the consumption GDP growth, it's been around 4%. That's the government figures. If you look at it, and whereas the investment GDP is growing at a much faster pace of about 10%. Overall GDP, therefore, is about that 7.5 odd percentage. And now the consumption GDP has to go up, then only the growth rate will further accelerate. And the way to do it is to have more income in the hands of consumers. And that's something both for rural and urban. As far as rural is concerned, I suppose, the government will do something there. As far as the urban market is concerned, taxation is one of the routes. If there are other routes which the government can think of to increase consumption, that's more than welcome.
Okay.